very typical to have a bit of imposter syndrome. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't deserve this.
Welcome to Top CEO. I'm chatting with Jennifer Harvey, who's CEO of the Crown Worldwide Group.
The business started in 1965. My father joined a moving company and within a year decided to start his own company. We're in 45 countries now. We have a property portfolio that's now valued at about 1.4 billion. In the pandemic, they all just kind of froze. We have to be profitable in order to keep going and reinvest.
What is your advice for the next generation of leaders?
The market is not the same as it was when your company started, so make sure you're continuing to keep it current because there's many family businesses that don't survive. I think you make the mistake in thinking that you need to be.
It's an interesting backstory from the company and also an interesting look at when businesses grow really big, but they start small and they start in some ways with your father. So in some ways it's a family business. So take us through what Crown Worldwide Group does and just the origination story and how you grew up in this business.
So the business started in 1965. My father was a 25-year-old who found himself in Japan. He, long story short, got there because his father was in the military. So when he finished college, he moved there and he joined a moving company and had a job. And within a year decided to start his own company. So with, I think, 4 other guys, he formed a moving company and their first piece of business was a contract with the US military. And to this day, when he tells that story, he can't believe he actually got that contract because they were just a startup. But it happened to be a time when Asia was exploding. And so they very quickly pivoted to the corporate market where they were helping big companies and organizations, first in the US and then across Europe, to send their people to Asia for the first time. And so the company pretty quickly expanded to first Hong Kong, then Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And so then it went from there. And today we're in over 40 countries.
And this business grew. I mean, give us a sense of the sort of the size and scale. And sometimes you forget about these kind of logistical type businesses that maybe aren't the sexiest ones that people are talking about, but that do a lot of business. So just in terms of like revenue and people and sort of scale, what is the business like today?
I think we're in 45 countries now. We have just over 3,000 employees. We have a property portfolio that's now valued at about 1.4 billion, and that's across all the continents we operate in. We're really proud of the diversity of our employees. So last time we counted, we had something like 78 nationalities speaking 56 languages. So we really are very, very diverse. And our revenues at the end of last year for the full year were around 600 million if you include all the companies in the group.
And those companies, which are interesting, include, I think you have relocations, which is helping more like individuals relocate across the world. You have information management, which is like helping companies that have boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of corporate documents that don't want it on the premises. You have a workspace business for moving, entire offices. And even specialty businesses like fine art handling, wine handling. And so these kind of this kind of logistical business, what was it like and what is it like to be a business where you're the second generation? This was started by your father. You presumably were learning about it since you were, tiny, walking around, and then you grow into it. What is that like for a business? How is that different as CEO when you have that kind of legacy versus just one of your competitors that doesn't have that kind of legacy?
Most people who work for us would agree it still feels like a family business. It's quite a nurturing environment. We're not publicly traded, so we can make long-term decisions. And that's not just talk, that's real. I have plenty of friends who have been part of organizations as they've gone public or they're PE owned, and we can do that. We can think a little long-term. And the other thing is because we're privately held, we have to sustain ourselves. Like we can't just get an infusion of capital. Like we have to be profitable in order to keep going and reinvest. So in terms of me personally, I have actually worked for the company now I started 30 years ago. So it is very much part of me. It's not just like that I was a kid growing up in it. I've done a lot of jobs. I've worked in Tokyo and Singapore and now New York. And I've traveled. I've been so lucky to travel everywhere. It's very personal, right? And I do think we have an executive team of, I think it's 13 people. And we had a ELT meeting, as we called it, this year. And we, just for fun, added up the number of years that each of the people had been just at Crown. And it was like over 300. So it's pretty crazy, right? I think people come and many, many stay because it is that kind of family environment. And it seems like people take a lot of ownership in what they do.
What does that mean then when you have people who've been there a long time? That gives a sense of, the culture of the company. There's continuity. There's sort of this kind of history of the company that gets infused. All of that stays the same, but we're also in a time of great change. And so a lot has to change now. And I imagine your kind of business, and when we've chatted before, you've indicated that like, hey, the pandemic was not only disruptive for, the pandemic itself, but in your type of business, there's like lasting, impact of the pandemic and just shifting entire lines of business, how people think about it, macroeconomic forces, where if companies aren't thinking about relocating people across the world as much, then that affects you a lot, correct? So how is, in a time of great change, is this an advantage, this sort of this historical legacy, or is it a challenge because you've got to change with the times?
Right. And what I was describing was the leadership team, but we have like huge numbers of like young, vibrant, or creative teams, even if they're young. Nothing against those of us of a certain age, but they do fuel that. And I haven't really talked about like the challenges specifically that we faced and the need to innovate, but we are doing. I love innovation, so I'm happy to create an environment that helps to drive that. And so we're communicating about it much, much more. I feel like I'm a broken record holding up examples of innovation or sharing what we're doing to drive innovation. But you need to do that in order to kind of change the perspective when we're coming out of a pandemic where we had to really lock down and try to survive. If you'd like, I can tell you a little bit about what happened to our business during the pandemic.
Yeah, I'd love to know more. And essentially, where your top revenue generating business, as I understand it, suddenly became the business in decline versus the other businesses that were more the support businesses then needed to take kind of like the pole position. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I mean that's been happening for longer than the pandemic, right? If you compare 10 years ago to today, our relocations business represented 80% of our revenue.
And then that's like relocating individual like people, like a household, because they're going to go work in Japan instead of the US or China instead of the US.
Right. Or it could be an ambassador. It could be, there's a lot of reasons that an organization would move someone, but moving for work, that say it was 80% of our business 10 years ago. Today, it's 45% of our business. And those other threes that you described, information management, workspace, and fine art, they represented, I think, 12% of our business 10 years ago. And today they're probably another 45 again. So, what happened in the pandemic, that shift was already happening, but in the pandemic, they all just kind of froze. And we needed to get very creative about, all right, if they're not pulling off hard copy documents from the shelf and we're not delivering them or getting new boxes, what are they doing instead? So, just to use that example, what companies needed was they needed us to digitize them and get them to their people who were all working from home. So we had to kind of create that process, how to do it safely. The data privacy is an enormous topic. Cybersecurity is an enormous topic in that space. So we had to start to shift towards digital in earnest during the pandemic. But that's, for obvious reasons, been a bonus that we can do that now in a more effective way and then help companies to create processes to safely digitize their information. So that's one example. Uh, in the workspace business, nobody was going to the office, so they certainly didn't need us to be, moving anything. So we had to figure out, well, what were they doing instead? And we quickly realized that actually, when you terminate leases, when you need to move to a smaller space, you still have a lot of work to do around that. And it might have to do with furniture, IT. And then when they set up a new place, what are the new goals instead, right? They might need a trophy office that attracts people to come for meetings, but they don't need an office that houses everybody. And so we started to get into the space of design and fit out, planning of spaces. And so that's how that one started to shift. And with fine art, that was a bit more of that's always been a bit more of a traditional business. And so instead of having to change as much, we were really introducing technology and sustainability to that business. And that's really the direction of travel for that business.
So how do you do it now as CEO? What are your biggest challenges as you sort of, I guess, skate to where the puck is, but skate to where the puck is going at the same time? How do you balance all of that? How much is just like, let's support the existing business, we need revenue coming in for this quarter? Or no, we actually have to fundamentally transform things, because just because it's this way this quarter doesn't mean that's going to be the same in 12 quarters from now. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because it's very tempting to think about where the puck's going and forgetting where the puck is now, right? But we have to think about where the puck is now, because that's today's money, right? So I think when we look at our strategy, we tend not to look too far ahead. There was a time where we talk about 10-year strategy, and we don't do that anymore. Instead, we look at sort of 3-year strategies, and that helps, I think, make it less different to what's happening today and what we think is going to happen in 3 years.
Okay. And what are then the biggest challenges, like that you need as CEO skills now that you didn't need 10 years ago? What is different now because your business has changed? How have you had to grow, or how are you growing personally?
Yeah, well, first thing I should say is I only have been CEO for about 13 months. Our past CEO was at the company for many, many years, I think 35, and he just passed away last August. I think in the past I was CEO of the Americas. So what I had to understand better was not only what's happening around the world, but what the differences in the businesses are, and what the differences in the markets are. So one size just doesn't fit all. And you need to understand that you could push a strategy very, very hard, and it's not the right strategy for a certain part of the world. Or you could mandate certain things and in the process stifle innovation, because there's a certain skill set within a team and they're doing something else that's really good that you should really encourage and foster, because it will help the rest of the company in the long term. So I had to kind of take several steps back and appreciate the wider landscape. That was one thing. But at the same time, I had to recognize that during the pandemic, part of the great innovations that happened, they happened because we didn't do as much centrally. The reason we didn't do as much centrally is we were in crisis mode, right? So each part of the business, we were communicating very actively as we tried to navigate what the heck was happening in our market, but there was a little bit less control globally. And as a result, some really interesting things were happening in individual markets. And so what I took from that is actually allowing latitude fosters innovation, and that's exactly what we need. So we try to kind of carry that through to today, where if, for example, if fine art in the UK comes up with a really unique proposition where they're giving museums a way to donate these really expensive crates that we can recycle and resell to other collectors, like, well, I wouldn't want to stifle that, right? It's a great idea. It supports our sustainability goals. It's a new source of revenue. And that wouldn't have happened if we were micromanaging them.
The idea, and particularly it's a challenge when you're a global company in that many countries, is you want sort of control to get everyone moving in the same direction. But an interesting cost of that control is maybe, you know, you don't get all the innovation and all the ideas if you want, because everyone is focused on just like moving in the same direction. And that can be a great source of innovation if you know how to sort of encourage it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's one way, right, is to allow the different countries and the different regions the latitude to do that. And I think it goes a long way to engaging your people too. They're more likely to stay if they feel like they have a bit more say, right? If they have the flexibility to build their own part of the business. And so it has that benefit as well.
So how do you make sort of a logistics business like this like sexy? How do you think about it marketing wise? How do you make people care? There's a lot of industries that make the world run, but we don't think about them all the time. So how do you make this type of business sexy?
You don't think the transportation business is sexy?
Oh, I do, of course. I do, Jennifer, but I'm not like the average person. So I love making, actually that's entirely what we do. We have a global marketing agency. Entirely what we do. Big portion of our business is making things sexy. We think they're fascinating and interesting. But how do you do it? How do you think about your marketing, your message? Has that changed now as the business is changing?
Joking aside, I know what you mean, because I've been at dinner parties and people say, "What do you do?" And when I say it, like I can see the look on their face. But I think the way we attempt to differentiate ourselves, other than our global footprint, which is quite unique in most of the lines of business we're in, although we're not totally global in every line of business. In fine art, we're in very specific locations. But I believe what differentiates us the most are probably two things. One is we tend to be very people-centric. And as much as we all want things automated and self-serve, when it comes to the types of things that we have to transport or store or handle, they're all pretty sensitive, right? So if you were moving your parents' china across the world because you liked it and you want to keep it, like you don't want anything bad to happen. You don't want it to be lost or damaged. And so that's sensitive. Information is very sensitive, right? This is companies' memory. Whether it be their digital information or their hard copy information, they definitely don't want anything lost. And then on the fine art side, that goes without any explanation. It's irreplaceable. And then on the workspace side, that's company assets, right? It's expensive to replace. And so because all of these things are quite sensitive, our client base doesn't want the process to be so automated that they can't deal with a person. And so I think that's what differentiates us as our people. And we've even commissioned large kind of market research to be done so we could understand where our positioning was different, for example, than our competitors. And that message comes through over and over, is that we're a little more people-centric. And then even our internal employee experience survey, which we do once a year, it comes back with the same thing, where one of the things they value the most is the people they work with. So I think that distinguishes us. The other thing would be, for the past 5 years or so, we decided to go through a process of like defining our purpose, which sounds a bit, fluffy, but it's really given us something to hang on to. And that is about making it simpler to live, work, and do business anywhere. And so when we need to make a decision, we can kind of turn back to our purpose, which is to make it simpler. And I think the reason that's the most material for us is that the business we're in is not simple. And so maybe that's the answer to your question, is what's kind of sexy about transportation and logistics is it's very complicated, right? There's so many pieces to a process, and it depends where it's going, and it depends what the cargo is. And that's what makes it really interesting and, I would say, sexy.
Okay. Well, and as CEO, and you're relatively new in the CEO position, and just looking over your entire career, what is the best advice you've received, either from other CEOs, other executives, maybe your father? What is the best advice you've received?
I've received so much advice, but I think one thing I've learned in the past year is that, when you step into a role like this, it's very typical to have a bit of imposter syndrome, right? I haven't had a CEO role before. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't deserve this. And I think you make the mistake in thinking that you need to be excellent at everything, every part of the job. But in fact, what some advice I received was, first thing is to understand like what you're good at. So one thing I did in the first 6 months of taking this role was, or maybe it was 9 months, is I did a 360. Like I initiated a 360 and it went to HR and I couldn't see who said what, but I wanted to understand like what was working for people or what wasn't working for people. And I could see what the perceived strengths were or what would be things that could go better. And instead of, my first instinct was I got to look at the stuff I wasn't the best at and get better at it. And the advice I got was, actually what you want to do is lean into what you're great at, right? Because if you lean into what you're great at, that's going to produce excellence. Whereas the things that you're not as good at, you could, of course, you want to work on them, but maybe you're more likely to get to competent. So what you want to do is beef up your team in those areas. And so I think that makes the whole job seem a little bit less scary and impossible.
Well, and that begs the question, Jennifer, what are you great at?
You're not supposed to ask me that. Okay. I would say the things that I've been told, or in that 360 was told, was that I'm better at connecting with people. And I think that's because I'm quite curious about people. So in terms of building trust with people, communicating well, those were kind of my strengths, that and maybe like a little commercial orientation. So communicating like what's going to make our business work, what matters in terms of what they can do. Like those were the strengths. You're not going to ask me my weaknesses, I hope.
Well, I won't ask you your weaknesses, but I am going to ask you this, because I asked you the best advice you'd ever received. What is the worst advice you've received?
I may have just put it out of my mind. I think any advice, and this is probably a little dated. I wouldn't say most people would say this now, but maybe people of older generation would be, if you only give people the good news because they don't want to hear the bad news. And that's not my philosophy, because if I don't know the bad news, how can I fix it? So I think there's some mindset that, don't get into too much detail on the challenging stuff. I think that's kind of anti-transparent. So I don't think that's very good advice.
And what has been the most challenging day in your professional career?
Probably there was a point during the pandemic where we spun off a part of our business, and it was a part of the business related to that relocation business that was already struggling, but in the pandemic it was, we just couldn't sustain it. So we didn't have the scale, I would say, to sustain that business. And so we spun it off, and probably the day, or one of the days, I had to like make really tough decisions or communicate with the team. Like that whole space was tough.
What is your advice for other CEOs where they have to communicate less good news, bad news, difficult information to their team? How should one do that?
What I found to be helpful was, as soon as I could pull in like a senior and trusted member or members of my team, it just helped, because you're carrying so much before you can communicate it, even just not to everybody, but a little further. It's a lot to carry. And I've gone through this with members of my team that might be sitting in a specific country and they have to do some kind of reorganization. And I can see the weight on them. And I'm like, okay, let's find the earliest date that you can share this with just even one trusted kind of lieutenant. And it will just change everything, because you have a thinking partner that's local. It's just so much better. So that's what I would say is, first of all, it seems like the worst thing and you can't get through it, but you can. And second is, the sooner you can trust and share it with somebody else, the better, the more tolerable the experience is going to be.
I see. And what do you think that other leaders in your industry miss, that you think they would be wise to focus on? What do people miss about the industry that is actually important?
I think maybe going back to the people orientation is that I'm not inside our competitor organizations, but I see how they present themselves either on the internet or in their collateral, if they speak at conferences. And I think that maybe sometimes it becomes too transactional and it's just all about growing the scale. Maybe it has to do with their ownership, and they have certain expectations set on how fast they're growing or something like that. But I think that they miss having a more people orientation and a culture that either keeps people there or makes it a great place to work, because your P&L, it's got to sustain itself, especially if you're a private company. But don't you want it to be an environment where people like to come to work too, right? And it's actually a bit of fun.
Finally, what is your advice for the next generation of leaders? And I'll ask it two ways. One, just for general leaders of global companies, but two, also the next generation of leaders of family businesses. What is your advice, given you've worked in every part of the business, you've worked in it for 30 years, you've recently been elevated to CEO. What is your advice for that next generation of leaders?
I think people in my situation, they are as varied as CEOs anyway, right? There are probably people out there that take for granted the opportunity to have. There's probably people that they may resent it, right? They don't want to do it. I think there's every kind of scenario. For me, I feel a huge sense of responsibility, right? This is something that someone else, my father, he put his blood, sweat, and tears into it, and he cares that it continues. And so for me personally, not for every person who's next generation leader, it's just a huge sense of responsibility. And I want the company to succeed for him as well as for all the people who work there. So in terms of advice, I would say, one, make sure your heart's in it, right? And that you're doing it for the right reasons. And two, also forge your own path, right? Because the market is not the same as it was when your company started. So make sure you're continuing to keep it current, because there's many, many family businesses that don't survive because maybe they're sitting kind of based on their past successes.
Thank you for joining us, Jennifer Harvey, CEO of Crown Worldwide Group. And what an interesting business to, I think, founded, by your father with $1,000 to growing to a truly global billion-dollar footprint company, and in an incredibly interesting time of great change. We're eager to see what happens next, and eager to see how you grow as CEO.
Thank you.